you. And thank you all. I've been having a really lovely time here. It's a very intimate conference. I've been to some conferences that work like well-oiled machinery, where everything's on time and everything goes smoothly. This is not one of them. But it's very, very good-natured, and I think we owe a lot to Gary for that, because he's so generous. And he keeps so optimistic and cheerful, even when some people would be really worried. So I think it's great he set the tone. One tiny logistic thing, if any of you want to get my newsletter, which I send out about every 6 weeks, it's very short, tells of latest advances, new experiments, upcoming appearances, and so forth. You can sign up via my website. There's a sheldrake.org is the website, and you can sign up for the newsletter there. It's free, of course, and infrequent and short. Gary asked everyone to say something about synchronistic experiences. So before I start on my talk, I do have one story to share. When he said that, my mind went blank, because I have them quite a lot, but I forget them very quickly. Unless you write them down, you forget them. They're a bit like dreams. When you're having a dream, it's extremely intense, and you think, I could never forget this. And if you don't write it down the minute you wake up, generally speaking, it's gone within 2 or 3 minutes. And that's true of most of my synchronistic experiences. Anyway, I had one recently. I live in London, in Hampstead. I was walking on Hampstead Heath, which is a 1,000-acre open area right near our house. I was talking to our son, Merlin, who's 26 and who's doing a Cambridge PhD in science. And I was talking to him about some of my morphic resonance experiments. I hadn't seen him for a while because he'd been in the jungles of Panama doing field work. And I was talking about some experiments done in France by a scientist called Hill. And I was talking about some new experiments that I've just got started on morphic resonance in cell biology. Hill discovered a kind of morphic resonance effect in cell cultures, which is totally fascinating. And I'm having these experiments repeated as we speak. And I was telling Merlin about these experiments repeating the Hill effect. And I hadn't talked to Merlin about it for over a year. And I hadn't heard from Hill for well over a year. And when I got back home and switched on my computer and switched on the emails, there was an email from Hill. And I hadn't heard from him for more than a year. And he said, I've got something really important to tell you. I'm just checking I've still got the right email address. And so this was a synchronicity. But it could have been telepathic. Some of them could be telepathic. It could have been Hill thinking about me that made me start talking about him. It could have been me talking about him that reminded him he'd got something to tell me. Some synchronicities can have a telepathic component to them, and I think this one probably did. Well, I'll be coming on to telepathy soon, but this evening's talk is on the extended mind, by which I mean the mind extended beyond the brain. And what I'm going to be suggesting this evening is that our minds are much more extensive than our heads. They stretch out beyond our heads and beyond our bodies through fields, mental fields. Now, we're all used to the idea of fields which stretch out beyond physical objects. A magnet has a field which is inside the magnet and stretches out all around the magnet, invisibly. And you can reveal it through its effects on iron filings, for example. The Earth has a gravitational field that's inside the Earth and stretches out invisibly all around it, keeps the moon in its orbit. Your cell phone, currently turned off, has an electromagnetic field within it, which, when it's turned on, sends out radio waves, electromagnetic waves, beyond the cell phone. The fields are invisible regions of influence that structure things or cause effects within their region of influence. And I think that our minds are systems of fields that are normally centered in our brains, but stretch out far beyond them. just as a magnetic field's in the magnet and stretches out beyond it. They stretch out invisibly. This room is full of invisible radio and television and cell phone transmissions. We can't see them. And I think our mental fields are invisible in the same way, but nevertheless have effects, just like electromagnetic and gravitational fields have effects. That's what I'm talking about this evening. That's just an overview, so you see the kind of thing I'm saying. And the reason that this is different from what you're used to hearing is that the normal options we have about the nature of the mind are two. We've had a choice of two models. The two mainstream models are firstly the materialist model. The mind is the brain. It's nothing but the activity of the brain, and it's inside your head. The other is the Cartesian dualist model that I talked about a couple of days ago. The mind and the body are totally separate. The mind's not in space and time. It's immaterial and of a totally different nature. So it's non-material and it's not located in space and time. What I'm suggesting is something that's intermediate. The mind is located in space and time. Your minds and my minds are right now located inside this room. They are located in space and time. They're normally centered in the brain, but they stretch out far beyond it. Now, the easiest way to understand how minds may stretch out beyond brains is to consider the nature of vision. And I'm talking now about regular vision, like you seeing me now, rather than visionary experiences, William Blake and so forth. I'm talking about ordinary vision. How do you see? Everyone in this room knows the standard theory. The standard theory is that as you see me now, light's reflected from me, travels through the electromagnetic field, enters your eyes, inverted images on your retinas, changes in the cone cells, impulses up the optic nerves, and regions of activity in the brain, which can be revealed in great detail by brain scanning techniques. We know more about what happens in the brain than has ever been known before. And all this is very good as far as it goes. But the trouble is it doesn't go that far in explaining vision. First of all it does really is describe changes happening in the brain. Well, is that the same as vision? Well, no. First of all, when you see something, you're conscious of what you're seeing. There's no explanation in any of this for consciousness itself. As I mentioned on Friday evening, the very existence of consciousness is called the hard problem, because there's nothing in physical and chemical sciences that could explain why anything should be conscious. But the point that I'm stressing this evening is not so much the consciousness issue as the question of where is your vision located. You see, the standard theory says you have all these changes happen in the brain, and then you see something. Now, you're seeing me and you're seeing this room in 3 dimensions and in full color. Where is that visual image? Where's that visual experience located? The conventional theory says it's inside your head. All mental activity is inside your head. It's nothing but the activity of the brain. And the activity of the brain is described by neurophysiology. Some modern consciousness researchers say that what happens is that the brain then produces a virtual reality display inside the head in 3 dimensions and full color, and that's what you're experiencing. Well, this is just a theory. When people have done brain operations on conscious patients, no one's ever seen a 3-dimensional virtual reality display inside anyone's head. So this is simply an act of faith. But it's taken for granted by materialists that this is what's happening. There was a recent paper in a prestigious journal called Behavioral and Brain Sciences, in which a materialist philosopher wrote a paper called "Is Your Skull Beyond the Sky?" He argued that your skull is beyond the sky. When you look at the sky, your experience of the sky is a subjective experience. Therefore, it must be inside the brain, like all subjective experience. Therefore, your skull must be outside everything you experience, beyond the sky. This is just a virtual skull produced by this virtual reality display inside the brain, and it's all inside your head. Well, when you think about it, that's a pretty improbable theory, and yet that is the mainstream orthodox theory taken to its logical conclusion. What I'm suggesting this evening is a theory that's so simple it's hard to grasp. and that is that your image of me is indeed in your mind. It's constructed by you, interpreted by your mind, etc. But it's not located inside your head. It's located right here, where I'm standing, outside your head, outside your body. In other words, what I'm suggesting is that vision involves a two-way process. Light moves into your eyes, changes happen in the brain, and then the images are projected out to where they seem to be. This room is full of our visual projections. They're invisible, just like radio waves are invisible. If everyone switched on their mobile phone, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference just by looking. And you can't tell the difference just that this room's full of all our visual projections. But nevertheless, I think that's what's happening. Your image of me is located where I am. My image of you is located where you are. My mind is reaching out through mental fields, perceptual fields, projecting out images of you which coincide with where you are. Sometimes images don't coincide with where things or people are, and then it's an illusion or a hallucination. But those are fortunately rare. Otherwise, we wouldn't be able to get around without bumping into things, and it would be a disaster. So we project out these images in our mental fields to where they seem to be. So what I'm suggesting is that even in the simplest act of perception, our minds are projected out way beyond our brains. They extend out into the world around us. When we go out and look at a star at night, and we can see the stars so clearly here, it's a real treat to see stars and the moon so clearly. I'm suggesting that our minds reach out to touch them, literally over astronomical distances. Now, this is not a new theory of vision. I claim no originality or credit for this view. It's the view of vision put forward by Plato in ancient Greece. It's the view of vision put forward by Euclid, the great Greek geometer. And Euclid was the person who realized that if you project out what you're seeing, when you look at something in a mirror, because your outward projections are mental and they're creating virtual images, they're not bounced off the mirror like light is. They go straight through it. And that's why you see things in a mirror. What you're seeing is your mental projections. Every time you look in a mirror, you're seeing virtual images which are projected out by your eyes. We're so used to these everyday phenomena, we forget how mysterious they are. Every time you experience a mirror, you're actually experiencing this mental projection. If you look at school physics textbooks, when they explain mirror images, you'll remember probably from school that you see the light bounce off the mirror, and then there's a line from the eye goes out, and there's little dotted lines go back to the virtual image behind the mirror. And it says the virtual image is projected to a place behind the mirror. They have the projection theory even in modern school textbooks. There's no other way of explaining it. And that's just what I'm saying. There's a projection of mental images out from the eye. Now, this is what people in ancient Greece thought, what the Romans thought, what the Arabs thought, what the people thought in the Middle Ages. It's what people think in India and China and Tibet and Africa. All around the world, it's taken for granted that vision involves a two-way process. And until children are aged 10 or 11 in the West, they think that too. A recent survey carried out in Ohio State University showed that the great majority of young children think that vision involves a two-way process. The developmental psychologist Jean Piaget found just the same in his studies in Europe, that children think that images are projected out. But Piaget said by the age of 10 or 11, children learn the correct view, which is that thoughts and images are invisible things located inside the head. So all of us probably thought what I'm saying this evening when we were children. And then we were taught the correct view, and we thought we wanted to be grown up and stuff, and we said, well, our thoughts and images are all inside our heads. And yet, no one's ever seen a thought or an image inside a head. We took the whole thing completely for granted because the dominant materialist paradigm is so strong that how could you possibly challenge this when you're 10 or 11? So the idea that it's all inside the head is nothing but an assumption. And I think it's a remarkable thing that our entire civilization has been bemused by this spell, this belief system, that it's all inside the brain, and without a shred of evidence for centuries. And we are now teaching this to people all over the world. The school science lessons with the materialist flavor are the same in India, China, South America, Africa. Kids everywhere are learning what's called the scientific view, which I think is just wrong. I think children under 10 have got it much more right than we have. And of course, children like seeing it that way, and that's why children's stories presuppose influences from the eye. Superman comics often show rays going out of his eyes. Roald Dahl's story, Matilda, has Matilda being able to move things with her eye beams. Children love this. It fits with the way they think. Well, I'm not putting this forward as a philosophy. I'm putting it forward as a scientific hypothesis, and that means it should be testable. Can you test it? If my mind reaches out to touch you when I look at you, then I may be affected. It may be that I'll affect you just by looking at you. And of course, if you see me looking at you, then that's ordinary psychology and nothing surprising. What if I'm behind you and you don't know I'm there and I stare at your back? Could you feel it? Now, as soon as you ask that question, you see this is a very common experience. The feeling of being stared at is extraordinarily common. Most people, including most children, have experienced it. Recent surveys have shown it's almost universal. There is a slight sex difference. More women than men have experienced being stared at, and more men than women have experienced staring at others and making them turn around. But most of us are mere amateurs. And when I got interested in this subject, I thought, well, I'll talk to the professionals. So I, or my research assistant, called up people involved in surveillance. There are people whose job it is to watch others for a living. We spoke to the store detectives in several London department stores. We spoke to the drug squad at Heathrow Airport. We spoke to police officers, and we spoke to private detectives. And one of the things we learned was that when you're being trained to be a private detective, all these people took it for granted. They all said, yes, of course. The private detectives were the most interesting, because they told us about these training courses. When you're training to be a private detective, I'm assuming most people here haven't been on a private detective training course. So I'll let you into one of their secrets. When you're being trained how to follow somebody, the first thing you learn is don't stare at their back. Because if you do, they're likely to turn around, catch your eye, and then your cover's blown. You have to look at them a little bit, otherwise you lose them. But you look at their feet. So this is completely taken for granted by these practical people. In the British SAS, the special services, when they're being trained how to creep up behind people to stab them in the back, they're told don't stare at their back, because they'll feel you coming and shoot you first. And in the martial arts, this is taken for granted. And many martial arts traditions have a way of training people to increase their sensitivity to being looked at from behind. If you can feel somebody looking at you from behind and approaching you to attack you, you're more likely to escape than if you can't feel it. This is useful. It's not just a curiosity. It's a very useful thing to be able to feel. And you can increase your sensitivity. They train people. Now, what does science have to tell us about this phenomenon? Well, until recently, until the 1980s, virtually nothing. Between 1890 and 1985, there were 4 published papers on this subject in the entire world scientific literature. The first 2 were written by skeptics in the late 19th and early 20th century, saying that this was an illusion and that it didn't really happen. It was just a superstition, an unscientific belief. And some scientists who've studied this more recently have said the same thing. It's an illusion, and it should be eradicated by proper scientific education. So their view is that the fact that people say they've experienced this should be stamped out by education. And in an experiment at Ohio State University, they actually got psychology undergraduates, and they found that many of them believed in the sense of being stared at. So they gave them a special course, 2 or 3 lectures, emphasizing over and over again that nothing goes out of the eyes, this is impossible, it can't possibly happen, it's just an illusion, it's just a coincidence, and so forth. And then they tested them straight afterwards, and they found that most of them registered the new belief they'd just been indoctrinated with. When they retested them 6 months later, most of them have reverted to thinking, yes, this does happen because it happened to me yesterday. And so their attempt to educate people out of their own experience failed. They wrote a paper lamenting how persistent this illusion was in the population and how persistent superstition was, and so on. Well, the two other papers in the literature were where people had actually tested it scientifically and found it worked. But when they were published, instead of there being headline news in the New York Times and that sort of thing, there was absolute silence. They were completely ignored because this phenomenon ought not to occur given the dominant materialist paradigm. It turns out it's quite simple to do experiments on it, and the experiments are so simple a child can do them. And in fact, thousands of children already have done them. They've been done extensively throughout the school system in Connecticut and also in Britain and Germany. And the basic experiment involves people working in pairs. The subject wears an airline-style blindfold to cut out peripheral vision. The other person sits behind them and in a random series of trials either stares at the back of their neck or looks away and thinks of something else. And in each trial, there's a click or a beep to indicate when the trial begins, and people have to guess within 10 seconds if they're being looked at or not. They say looking or not looking, and they're right or they're wrong. By chance, they'd be right 50% of the time on average. In these experiments, over and over and over again, independent replications in many countries now, the overall score comes out between 55 and 60%. Not a big effect, but highly significant when you have hundreds of thousands of trials. The biggest of all these experiments has been running for about 20 years now in the Amsterdam Science Museum, an automated version of the test where a computer tells you whether to look or not, has tested tens of thousands of people. It's one of the biggest experiments ever done. And it's coming up with extremely significant results, highly positive, significant results. Interestingly, in my own experiments and in the Amsterdam experiment, the most sensitive subjects are children under the age of 9. That's one of the reasons I've done quite a lot of my own research in primary schools. And I found it was actually quite easy to do the research in schools because school teachers use the power of the gaze all the time. It's part of their stock in trade. So it's no surprise to them. The idea of looking at someone in a penetrating way affects them. A naughty boy at the back of the class with his back to the teacher can very quickly be brought to turn round again by the suitable use of the teacher's gaze. This seems to be a real phenomenon. There's been a parallel line of research on the sense of being stared at using closed-circuit television. A lot of this has been done by Marilyn Schlitz, who's here with us at this conference. When she was working with William Broad at the Mind Science Foundation in San Antonio, Texas, they started a line of research which is similar to what I've been doing with direct looking, but they used closed-circuit television. And instead of asking people to guess consciously, they measured the skin resistance, like in a lie detector, which measures emotional arousal, galvanic skin response. And people were looked at on a TV monitor in a different room. There was a CCTV camera running all the time. Some of the time they were being looked at, some of the time they weren't in random trials. And people's skin resistance changed significantly when they were being looked at compared with when they were not being looked at. And this was an unconscious physiological response. This has now been widely replicated, and I think that this is particularly interesting if you can tell when one person's looking at you on a CCTV screen. What if this were done on live television with 1 million people looking at you? Would you be able to tell more than with just one? I think you would. This experiment has not yet been done, but it's something that could be done on live TV, and it would be absolutely fascinating television. I've also interviewed surveillance personnel who use closed-circuit television, and most of them are convinced people can tell when they're being watched on CCTV. Most people don't notice, but people who are, as they call it, security conscious or surveillance conscious, which includes people who are potential terrorists, criminals, etc., or drug smugglers, become much more sensitive than others. I gave a talk on this in Washington, D.C. 2 or 3 years ago, and one of the people in the audience told me afterwards that he was in the FBI, and he'd been trained in surveillance at an FBI surveillance training course. And he said their trainer had told them that if you see someone doing something that they shouldn't do, like smoking in a no-smoking area on the CCTV, the trainer had said, just stare at them hard on the screen and they'll stop. And I said, does it work? He said, every time. So this is taken for granted in places like the FBI. Within the academic world, people go crazy if you suggest this could possibly be real. There's a kind of culture of denial and defense of the paradigm, but move outside of that narrow world. Everyone, including children, just take this for granted. It's part of everyday experience, and the professionals are very aware of it. It happens with animals too. I interviewed wildlife photographers and people who do deer stalking, hunters, about whether they'd found animals could pick up when they were being watched. And the reason I asked these specialist groups is because most of us wander through woods and stuff in a rather clumsy, noisy way, and most animals can hear us coming from miles away. But wildlife photographers who want to get rare animals, good shots of them, spend hours quietly in blinds, hiding and in darkness with telephoto lenses. And hunters stalking animals keep downwind, and they're very careful not to give them any clues. People like that, almost all of them, are convinced that when you focus your attention on the animal through the telescopic sight of the rifle or through the telephoto lens, unless you take the thick picture or shoot the animal very quickly, they'll soon detect your attention and they'll run away. Again, so this was very widespread. I also found there's a lot of information about people detecting the look of animals. I looked into the big game hunting literature. Probably most of you have never read Man-Eaters of Kumaon by Jim Corbett, where he describes his adventures as the chief tiger shooter for the British government in India, where there were villagers in the Himalayan regions were being terrorized by man-eating tigers, and the government would send for Corbett because he was their best shot for dealing with tigers. And Corbett says on many occasions his life was saved by feeling when a hidden tiger was looking at him. He felt the hair on the back of his neck prickling, and he knew that he was being watched by a tiger, and he said it saved his life by paying attention to this instinctive response. I think that this is a fairly basic animal response. I think it's probably very widespread in the animal kingdom, and it probably evolved in relation to predator-prey relationships. If a prey animal could tell when a hidden predator was looking at it, it would escape better than a prey animal that couldn't tell when a hidden predator was looking at it. And it seems that this ability is very widespread among animals, although there's been virtually no investigation so far of this effect in animals. It would be quite easy to do a laboratory experiment using a predator and prey, for example. I tried such an experiment at home with the simplest predator-prey relationship would be a cat and a mouse. So we've got the cat. The only problem was the mouse. And when I started catching wild mice to do this experiment, I'm afraid Jill objected to this particular experiment. But anyway, my experiment was that you videotape a cage with the mouse in. You have a one-way mirror that the cat looks at the mouse through a big piece of cardboard, and at random intervals you put the cardboard down so the cat can't see the mouse, and you lift it up so the cat can see the mouse. Does the mouse behavior change when the cat's looking at it? I can't tell you the answer because I never got to that crucial bit of the experiment. But we're not talking expensive science here. The inhibitory factor for this research is a taboo. This would be a great MSc project, even a great high school project. And the reason it hasn't happened is that when people try and do this in universities, until now, they're usually told, don't do it, it's a career ender to do anything like this. It's too controversial, even though it's really interesting. Now, the most vulnerable animals are at their most vulnerable when they're asleep. And so are sleeping animals sensitive to being looked at? Well, apparently they are, including sleeping humans. Lots of people have had the experience of being woken up by their dog or cat, just staring at them silently. And conversely, many people have found they can wake a sleeping animal by staring at it. This is actually one of my current projects, and the slogan is, "Don't let sleeping dogs lie." And many people find when they've got the baby to sleep, they avoid staring at the baby, the sleeping baby, because it's likely to wake the baby up. And if you've got the baby to sleep, then you just don't want to wake it up by just staring at it. So this is very widespread. It's part of everyday experience. It's extraordinarily under-investigated by science because of this taboo. And what it shows us is that the mind is much more extensive than the brain, not just through direct looking, but by paying attention to someone even on a screen, as in the CCTV experiments. I'm thinking of doing an online version of this using Skype-type technology. Most computers now have cameras, and it would be quite easy to set up an online experiment with variable numbers of people looking at somebody and seeing if they can tell when they're being watched online. Incidentally, my various experiments, as I develop them, I put them on my website, but I also announce them on my newsletter. So if you sign up for that, you'll hear about these new ones as they come online. So I think through perception, through visual perception, just through regular vision, our minds reach out beyond our brains, even out to the stars. And I think that even when we extend our vision with the Hubble Space Telescope and other telescopes so we can see galaxies beyond our own, that somehow human minds penetrate further out into the universe. And if these galaxies were exquisitely sensitive, they might suddenly think some new creatures are looking at us. They might even be able to tell where they're being looked at from, because this is not just a generic blanket sense, it's directional. In most cases, when people turn around, they turn around and look at the right place. I once was in a conference in Germany. I was on the 7th floor of a hotel, and I was gazing out of the window. There were a couple of people walking on the path down below, and I was just idly staring at them. And they stopped, and they didn't look round like this. They just looked straight up at where I was. And they couldn't possibly have heard me or seen me. So it's directional. Okay, so that's one way our minds are extended beyond our brains. Another way they're extended beyond our brains is through our bodies. Now, the idea in conventional science is that if you feel a pain in your big toe, the pain's actually inside your brain, because that's where your consciousness is, and it's referred to the big toe. I think if you feel a pain in your big toe, it's in the big toe. So I think that our minds extend throughout our bodies. Our bodies are shaped by what I call morphogenetic fields, and I'll be talking about those tomorrow. So I won't be going into the details of this field theory this evening. But suffice it to say that I think the mind extends through the body through these fields. Normally, the fields coincide with the limbs and the other parts of the body. But there are situations where you can actually separate the fields from the body, and that's what happens when people have had amputations. People who've had arms or legs amputated generally have phantom limbs. Sometimes they're painful, but it's almost always the case that after an amputation, people have a phantom arm or a phantom leg. The standard theory, again, is that it's in the brain, phantoms in the brain, that your brain generates the illusion of this missing limb and then refers or projects it to where the limb was. I think the phantom limb is exactly where it seems to be. If people have phantom arms, they can move them around like a regular arm. And they feel completely real to those who have them. I have at home a pamphlet produced by the US Veterans Administration entitled "What to Expect When Your Leg is Amputated." And in plain English, it tells soldiers who are about to have their legs amputated what to expect. And the first thing it tells them is that when you've had your leg cut off, it'll feel as if it's still there. It'll feel completely real. And you must remember that it's not there, because they have so many accidents in hospitals where amputees get out of bed and try to walk somewhere. It feels so real. They just fall over. And that's why they produced this special pamphlet. Now, what is this phantom limb? I think it's the morphogenetic field, the field of the missing limb. I think when you have a phantom arm, it's your arm field that you're experiencing from within. But it's invisible, of course. Now, can you detect it? This would be very interesting in relation to understanding the relation of mind and body. And in my book, 7 Experiments That Could Change the World, I have an experiment about phantom limbs. The subtitle of that book is A Do-It-Yourself Guide to Revolutionary Science. And what I do in that book is put forward 7 paradigm-shattering experiments that anyone can do on budgets of $10 or less. Because it's very hard to get funding for unorthodox scientific research. But if you can do experiments that don't cost anything or cost less than $10, anyone can do them. You don't have to ask permission. You don't have to spend years of frustrating grant application. You can just do it. The staring experiment is one of those experiments in that book. The phantom limb experiment is something, it requires an amputee, someone with a phantom arm. I recruited amputees through the British Limbless Ex-Servicemen's Association, soldiers who'd had amputations, who were good sports and who were up for being tested. I also recruited people who work in subtle energy medicine. And how the experiment worked was that I had them at my home in London. We were in a room with a door, a normal room with a normal door. And we marked on the door with paper and blue tack 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So there's 6 panels in the door that we marked on both sides of the door. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Then on one side of the door is the amputee with a phantom arm and my research assistant who threw a die to pick a random number between 1 and 6. And then asked this person to push their phantom arm through the panel, say panel 2. Phantom arms go through solid objects, being phantoms. So now on the other side of the door, in the room where I am, I don't know which one the phantom arm is sticking through. There's this door, and in one position in the door, there's a phantom arm sticking through it. So we then invite the subtle energy practitioners in one by one and say, there's a phantom arm sticking through one of those panels. Can you tell us which one it is? And we found some of these people were really good at telling where the phantom arm was. And they couldn't have known by any normal means. They felt there, and one of them dowsed. They had different techniques, but some of them were really good. It was way above chance. No one's ever followed this up, but I think this is a fascinating experiment. Anyone who's doing work in subtle energy medicine or in wants a student thesis, even be a good high school or science fair project. It's a fascinating project with huge implications. And again, it costs nothing. So that's not the barrier in many cases for this research. It's not the cost, it's the mental barriers that imprison us in this paradigm. Now, I'm going to move on to a whole other range of phenomena involving the extended mind. I've talked so far about ones that involve attention. And the word attention comes from the Latin roots ad tendere. Ad means towards, tendere means to stretch, as in tension, tent, etc. So attention means literally stretching your mind towards something. Intention means stretching your mind into something. And our minds are extended through our intentions as well as through our attention. And I think that's the basis of telepathy. When people are in a social group, like in a flock of, when animals are in a social group, like a flock of birds or a termite mound or a school of fish, they're all related to each other. And I think the relationship between them is because they're all within a group field, a morphic field of the group. Again, I'll talk more about these fields tomorrow. So when one changes, all the others can feel it. That's why flocks of birds like starlings can fly along, thousands of them, and suddenly change direction, the whole flock, without bumping into each other. It's why schools of fish can suddenly change direction if a predator appears without bumping into each other. It's too quick to be explained by just looking at the nearest neighbors. It's a field phenomenon. I think all social animals have fields that link the members of the social group together. And when some members of the group go away, for example, when wolves go hunting to find food to feed their young, who they leave in a den, the cubs are left with a babysitter, usually the adults go hunting. This field that links them stretches rather than breaks. It's a bit like an invisible elastic band that continues to connect them. And if a change happens in one, the others can pick it up. I think that's the basis of telepathy. The closest analogy in physics is with quantum non-locality. If two electrons or two photons that have been part of the same system move apart, photons at the speed of light can move apart. If a change happens in one, the other instantaneously changes, even if it's thousands of miles away. It's called quantum non-locality or non-separability. And something very similar, I think, underlies telepathy, and it typically occurs between bonded members of social groups. Because I think telepathy is a normal means of communication between animals in social groups, my first investigations were on animals. And I found that virtually no one had ever studied telepathy in animals. It's a taboo topic in universities. There's hardly any universities in the US where you can study telepathy, probably one or two. The number of full-time parapsychologists in the United States, I think probably about 3 at the moment. The number of card-carrying skeptics subscribing to these skeptical magazines and organizations is about 150,000. So the parapsychology researchers are outnumbered about 50,000 to 1 by well-funded skeptic organizations. So this is a taboo phenomenon. It's not to do with costs. It's not to do with the fact these things aren't interesting. It's much more interesting than most research that actually does get done. Anyway, virtually no research on telepathy in animals. So I decided to study it in the animals we know best, like dogs and cats. And so I started by collecting stories from people about their animals. I have more than 5,000 on my computerized database of unexplained animal powers. Things that look like telepathy, dogs, cats, parrots, horses, and other animals picking up their owners' intentions. Premonitions of earthquakes and other disasters, very common with animals. I've studied all the major recent earthquakes, and in almost every single one, animals have known about it, hours or days in advance. And the sense of direction, another very mysterious power in animals, goes way beyond what you can explain with magnetism, the way that dogs and cats can often find their way home over hundreds of miles. And homing pigeons do this on a routine basis in pigeon races. Anyway, among these stories, one of the things I ask people is, does your dog or cat seem to pick up your intentions? Now, there's many ways in which people feel they do. For example, I have more than 200 stories from cat owners about how their cats seem to know when they're planning to take them to the vet. Cats hate going to the vet. And I get these stories over and over again. Whenever I want to take my cat to the vet, when it comes to the time to get the cat to take it to the vet, I can't find the cat, it's hiding. And people, when it's happened a few times, people try not to give any clues. They don't let the cat see the carrying basket. They try not to think of the vet. Some of them, the cat still seems to know. And some people, in despair, call the vet from work to make the appointment so the cat can't overhear. And then they swing by to pick up the cat after work, but it's still not there. We heard so many of these stories. We did a survey of all the vets listed in the North London Yellow Pages, 65 veterinary clinics. We called them all up and said, do you ever have a problem with people missing appointments with cats? 64 out of 65 said, yes, it happens all the time. And the remaining one said, it happens so often we've dropped the appointment system for cats. People just have to turn up with them. Well, one of the commonest kinds of stories I've heard is from dogs that know and cats that know when their owners are coming home. The people at home know that the absent person's on the way because they see the cat go to the door or window and wait, sometimes for 20 minutes, half an hour before the person comes home. I've got more than 50 stories on the database from women saying that their partner or husband is a plumber or a taxi driver or a lawyer or somebody who works irregular hours, so they don't know when he's coming home. But the dog lets them know by waiting at the door, so they have 15 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour's warning. So they make the meal so when this lucky man arrives home, there's a hot meal on the table for him. I've got very few stories from men about, it doesn't work the other way around so often. Not so many men make meals for women. But this is very common behavior, and it happens even when they come at non-routine times and in unfamiliar vehicles, or by public transport, like the New York subway. You can't tell, a dog couldn't tell which subway train their owner was on. Even if they could hear a vague rumbling of subway trains, you wouldn't know which one your person was on. And still they know when people are coming home. Well, we've now done lots of experiments on this. What we do is film the place the dog's waiting the whole time that the person is out with a time code on the videotape. We then have the person go at least 5 miles away. We tell them when to come home at a randomly chosen time by cell phone or pager, and then they travel home in an unfamiliar vehicle, usually a taxi, a different taxi each time. The most expensive aspect of this research is the taxi fares. And so we've got records of hundreds of occasions when dogs respond to their owners coming home. In the most sensitive dogs, they do it almost every time. 80% of the time, they respond when the owner forms the intention to come home. There are some occasions when they don't respond, and with the most sensitive dog we looked at why not? Well, in most cases, it was when the dog was either sick or very tired after a long walk, or in the majority of the cases when it didn't respond, it was when there was a bitch on heat in the next apartment, proving that this dog could be distracted. But on most occasions, highly significant statistically, they're responding to the owner coming home. I did an experiment years ago for Austrian state television. The science unit of Austrian state television asked if they could do an experiment with one of the dogs I was working with, and I said yes, as long as it's a real experiment, random return time, coming in a taxi. And so they set this experiment up. I have a video here that shows you that experiment. It's a 5-minute clip. Because it was made for Austrian television, the soundtrack is in German. It was an English-speaking dog, of course, but there are subtitles. I hope you'll be able to see them. Well, lots of dogs and cats do this. Some parrots do it, some horses do it when people go to feed them. How many people here have had dogs or cats or have them now that do this? Well, that's a lot of people. I mean, this is a really common phenomenon. It's one of the, what I call, mysteries of everyday life. These are really common. They're not paranormal. They're normal. They're not supernatural. They're natural. They're ordinary experiences. This, again, would make a great student project for a high school science fair. And I have a children's book coming out on this phenomenon with an American children's book writer called Kate Banks. And our book's coming out later this year or early next year. It's called Boy's Best Friend. And it's about a 10-year-old boy whose dog knows when he's coming home, who does some experiments on it. Now, in the human realm, very similar principles apply. Telepathy occurs between people who are closely bonded, parents and children, lovers, husbands and wives, best friends, and sometimes therapists and clients who have a transference and countertransference. Jung and Freud both noticed this and wrote about it. One of the studies I've done, which I describe in my book, The Sense of Being Stared At, which is about my investigations on unexplained human abilities, is between mothers and babies. Many nursing mothers know when their baby needs them. Even when they're miles away, their milk lets down, their breasts get ready to feed the child, even if they can't hear it crying, can't hear any other baby crying. And I've done a detailed study on 20 nursing mothers showing that this is not a coincidence. At least it happens at the same time. It does seem to be a telepathic response. It's a physiological response. The mother's body responds to the baby's need, and then she thinks, my baby needs me. It's not her thinking and then the breast reacting. It's very, very basic. And if you think about it, it has huge evolutionary implications. Any mother that could tell when her baby needed her, when she was out of earshot, and who would then go to the baby, would have a baby more likely to survive than a mother that couldn't tell. And until the 20th century, the only way a mother could know when a baby needed her straight away, find out straight away, would be by telepathy. We now have telephones, but in a sense they do what mechanically what telepathy did over millions of years of mammalian evolution. This should apply to all mammals. All mammals, by definition, do breastfeeding. And I've never seen studies of this kind on any other species, but again, this is a huge potential field of research, not expensive, not complicated, and very, very interesting. So again, if any of you are doing projects in midwifery or in anything to do with nursing, then there's a possibility of doing a project of this kind and shedding more light on it. The commonest kind of telepathy in the modern world occurs in connection with telephone calls. And what happens there, I think, is to do with intention. When you call somebody, you form the intention to call them. You want to talk to them for some reason or another. Then you get your phone out, or you look up their number, and you dial their number, and you ring them up. But sometimes people can feel your intention before the call actually comes. And I've done surveys that show that more than 80% of the population in Britain, the United States, Germany, and Argentina have had the experience of thinking of somebody, and then shortly afterwards that person calls, and they say, "That's funny, I was just thinking about you." Or else they know who it is when the phone rings before they look at the caller ID or answer it. How many people here have had that kind of experience? Well, that's the vast majority, yes. So again, what does science have to tell us about this? Well, until recently, nothing whatsoever. The standard scientific armchair argument was to say, oh, it's just a coincidence. People think about other people all the time, and if someone rings, they imagine it's telepathy, but they just forget the millions of times they're wrong. It's just a coincidence. Most scientists, skeptic-type scientists, if you talk to them about this, will bring forward that argument. I guarantee it. Try it out on your skeptic friends. But they haven't got a shred of evidence for it. It's not an unreasonable hypothesis, but in science you don't just need a hypothesis, you need evidence. For that you'd need to do some actual experiments. And no one had ever done any experiments on this. Well, I've developed a simple experiment to test for this phenomenon. How it works is this. We find people who say this happens to them quite often. They sit at home with a landline phone, no caller ID, being filmed, so we know they're not getting other phone calls, email messages, text messages, etc. They give us the names and telephone numbers of 4 people they know well, family members or close friends. We pick one of the 4 at random from a random event generator or a throw of a dice, and we call the person up and say, please phone your friend now. They think about them for a minute or 2, then they call them. When the phone rings, if you're the subject, before you pick it up, you have to guess who's calling. So you might say, I think it's Steve. You pick it up, hi, Steve. You're right or you're wrong. By chance, you'd be right about 25% of the time. In fact, in these experiments, people are right over 40% of the time. With hundreds of trials, it's highly significant statistically. In fact, it's more significant than the existence of the Higgs boson. I've now developed automated tests that work on cell phones. I've just launched a new test that anyone can take part in. It's an internet-based one that works on cell phones or landlines. The new test works only in Britain at the moment. I launched it 2 weeks ago. I don't know how it's working yet. It's a beta version. It may have technical glitches. But once we've got it working properly, I'll roll it out in the US as well. And I invite you all to take part. If you have my newsletter or look at my website, you'll know when it's available. And it's very, very simple. It takes about 10 minutes. You need 2 other people to do the test. It's fun. You find out how telepathic you are. And you can even see if you can train yourself to become more telepathic. I have here, I don't have much time left, but I've got a short 5-minute clip now that shows one of these experiments that I did for British television. The TV team wanted to do it, and they wanted to do it with celebrities because it was television. So they did it with a girl band called the Nolan Sisters, who were big in the 1980s. And what you'll see here is this experiment. They were rather skeptical, and they quite wanted it not to work. I would have then ended up, having to say, oh, well, sorry, it didn't work. So it was a risk doing this. Doing these things like the Austrian dog experiment, it was a risk doing it. They would have shown it whatever happened. And so we did this. I had no idea. I'd never worked with these women before. I didn't know how telepathic they were. But they are sisters, and they're very close. So here's the experiment. Well, this kind of experiment's now been replicated at the universities of Freiburg in Germany and Amsterdam in Holland. So it seems to be replicable, and I've been running an earlier automated version over the last few years, which is giving consistently positive, significant results. So I'm pretty sure this is a real phenomenon, but we need more data, and I don't think that these paradigm changes are going to occur just through slogging it out in seminars, in universities, and publications in journals. I do that. All my data are published in scientific journals, peer-reviewed, and you can see all the papers on my website if you want the statistics and the details. They're all there. But I think these things will become social facts if they were more widely done. And what I'm hoping is that some of my new experiments can be turned into intuition training systems that people could, by practice, get better at it. And then what would really make it, would shift the paradigm and make it a social fact, is if there were contests for telepathy, the most telepathic person in California, with the finals on television, and then working up to the telepathy Olympics. And if that happened, people would have an incentive to practice, like people who learn all these acrobatic things for competitive sports. And if the telepathy Olympics were happening with gold medals and things, does telepathy exist would cease to be a question. It would become obvious that it exists. Most people think that anyway, but there's this culture of denial within the academic world maintained by these vigilante groups of skeptics, and which try to pretend in the mainstream media it doesn't happen. Most people know it does. But it would simply become a social fact, and the skeptic groups would become rather like the Flat Earth Society. They'd still exist, but they'd become of marginal significance instead of being given the credibility they don't deserve. There are many other ways in which the extended mind can be tested through experiments. And the mind is extended not only in space, but in time. And that reflects itself through precognitions and presentiments, precognitive dreams and presentiments. I don't have time this evening to go into those. And of course, the mind is extended in time through memory, the way we can remember things that happened long ago. And that's the theme of my workshop tomorrow morning. I was asked to tell you that after this, immediately after this, I'll be signing books here in the break before the panel discussion. But I want to end just by saying that this is one of the areas that I think is one of the most exciting areas in science, precisely because these phenomena have been so taboo and so marginalized within the academic world, so that people's careers have been wrecked by even letting anyone know they had an interest in them. There's been zero public funding for these, except by the US Army and the CIA during the Cold War, for the psychic spy program. The researchers in this area, still many of them are amateurs because you can't get professional grants and positions for this. But precisely because this field of science has been held back so much, in the 21st century, we've got almost virgin territory in many of these areas to explore. Now, that's not true in most areas of science. That almost all the things I've talked about this evening could be the basis for dozens of PhD projects looking into the details of how these things work. Many of them could be projects for school science fairs or for undergraduate or MSc projects. Many of these can be done by anyone who's interested. The telephone telepathy test, anyone in this room could do it when it's online here. Any of you who have dogs or cats that know when you're coming home could do filmed experiments. Webcams are now less than $100. This kind of thing makes science available to almost anyone who's interested. So I think that consciousness studies in general is the great frontier of science at the moment. It's been neglected for so long that there's so much that we could discover. And when you're moving into a new field of science, it's quite easy to make advances quite rapidly. There's lots of low-hanging fruit. In a science that's been very well developed with thousands of people working in it for years, it's a matter of filling in increasingly smaller details. But in this phase of a science, the big discoveries can be made relatively easily and relatively fast. So I just want to leave you with the thought that there's so much we don't know about the mind, human minds. Our own minds are the biggest mystery, really, to us. We know more about the further reaches of the cosmos than we do about the way minds work and their connection with other minds, other human minds, and other non-human minds as well. I think that we're on the threshold of a very exciting new phase of science. And things are beginning to change. And I think in the next 10 years or so, we'll see quite rapid and startling advances in these areas. Thank you.
Going to shrink.